Hi, I'm Stephen Vantassel. You're listening to Living the Wildlife, discussing all things related to vertebrate pest control as part of the Pest Geek Podcast family. This is the disclaimer for Wildlife Control Consultant and Pest Geek Podcast for the Living the Wildlife podcast. Always follow national, state, provincial, and local laws when using pesticides and or other control methods to manage pests. Wildlife Control Consultant, LLC, Pest Geek Podcast, Living the Wildlife Podcast, Stephen M. Vantassel, or their or his affiliates are not responsible for followers' use of the information provided here. Hi everyone, Stephen Vantassel here, Wildlife Control Consultant, bringing another episode of Living the Wildlife as part of the Pest Geek Podcast family. Hey, glad to have you on board. I hope your week went well. I've been quite busy of late. Did basically 9 presentations in 5 days last week, and then did 3 presentations in 1 day this week. So plus a lot of traveling. Had a chance to speak in another state. The audiences treated me pretty well. So that was certainly a pleasure. It always beats the alternative, as we say. So if you're, of course, interested in having me come speak for you, whether virtually or in person, you can definitely reach out to me at wildlifecontrolconsultant@gmail.com, wildlifecontrolconsultant@gmail.com. Book sales are moving along. I've been quite pleased with my latest, the sales of my latest book, the Vertebrate Pest Handbook. So it's basically a series of questions and answers on rodent control. So you can visit that by just going to my store here, and there it is, the Vertebrate Pest Handbook, and it's available for $23.95 post-paid to the United States, and of course my other publications are there as well. Well, this week I thought I would talk about Ignitable gas cartridges. So let me pull that slideshow up for you. There was a question I saw online where an individual had some questions about ignitable gas cartridges. He said, I mentioned it in my book. That's certainly true. That's the Wildlife Removal Handbook. But I guess he wanted some more information about it. So I figured, well, let's kind of talk a little about ignitable gas cartridges. But before we do that, do take a few moments, if you would, to ring the bell and subscribe to the channel. We'd love to have you join. Of course, you pass that along to a friend, because the Living the Wildlife podcast is dedicated to those individuals who are involved in vertebrate pest control, whether privately or commercially, and we try to provide technical information for those individuals so they can handle wildlife responsibly, carefully, and of course legally. And we'd like to have all 3 of those elements done. You can definitely reach out to me if you have questions. You can reach me at wildlifecontrolconsultant@gmail.com, wildlifecontrolconsultant@gmail.com. You'd like to be on the show, or you have a new product or service that you'd like to talk about, or perhaps even a gripe. I would love to have you interview. I think there's a lot of great information that's out there. We're just trying to get people over the fear of being on a podcast. You can talk to people that I've interviewed in the past. I am not that mean. So would love to have you. I don't play gotcha journalism. But nevertheless, even if you have a show idea, if you don't want to be on it, would love to hear from you, because we want to be sure we're providing information that can be useful for those in the field of vertebrate pest control. So the questions came in, was asked not of me directly, but I figured, well, I might as well talk about ignitable gas cartridges. So why don't we get started with that? Well, before we get too far into it, understand what a fumigant is. A fumigant is a pesticide that basically kills the animal through an aerosolization of the pesticide or the toxic material. That makes it different from a bait, right? So we have rodenticide baits. These are products that you've probably used maybe around your house, or perhaps a neighbor or a relative, and these are baits where the animal eats the poison. With a fumigant, it is inhaled, and so it's a different mode of entry of the pesticide into the animal's body. So there are benefits and detractions from fumigants, and so there's always pros and cons for all of our various options here. So let's talk about some of those. And what are the advantages of using fumigants? There is basically no secondary poisoning. So that is a huge advantage. You've probably heard a lot of things in the news about the concerns about particularly anticoagulants and some of the other rodenticide active ingredients. Secondary poisoning, for those of you that don't know, means that the first animal that eats the poison, that's primary poisoning. The animal that eats the animal that ate the poison, that's called secondary poisoning. So it's how that poison transmits through the food tree, the food chain. Okay, so secondary poisoning is becoming a big concern. This is part of the reason why California has been placing so many additional restrictions on the use of rodenticides, because it's been getting into their cougar and some of their other predators when they're doing research on these animals and testing them, and they're finding trace levels of some of these active ingredients, and so by adding further restrictions, in their opinion, they're able to hopefully reduce some of that secondary poisoning from occurring. Fumigants don't have that problem. So if the neighbor's dog is eating a ground squirrel that you fumigated and the dog gets sick, it's not from the fumigation, it's something else. And so that's definitely a win. There is also no residual toxicity once the gas dissipates. So there's nothing hanging around. Like one of the challenges with bait, for instance, is when you put bait out, it lasts for a while until an animal consumes it. Not the case with a fumigant, because it's slowly dissipating. Either it's being absorbed into the soil or it's gassed off into the air, and so it becomes so dispersed it's no longer toxic, because what's the solution to pollution is dilution, right? So this is an issue because the dose makes the poison, is something you may have also heard. And the other advantage with fumigants is they are weather tolerant. In other words, typically you want moist soil when you're using a fumigant. That's not the case for rodenticides, because with moist soil you can actually degrade the underlying grain or formulation of the bait when you're using a bait form of your rodenticide, right, as opposed to a fumigant. So those are three key advantages of fumigants. Well, what are some of the downsides or the disadvantages of fumigants? Well, cost and labor, right? Fumigants tend to be significantly more expensive. One researcher found that they, as a rule of thumb, found fumigant, whether both the material and or the application costs, 5 to 10 times more costly than using bait toxicants. That's when we use the word toxicants there. You say, well, aren't fumigants toxic? Yes, fumigants are toxic. We're referring here in terms of rodenticide baits, for example. You also have some challenges with fumigants in terms of safety around structures, because obviously gas can fit through cracks and crevices and get inside and leak its way into buildings, and you can have some harm to individuals inside the building. So you need to be careful when you're applying it close to buildings. Some of your ignitable gas cartridges say don't use near a building, right? So you may not, what's near? Well, becomes kind of a challenge, right? How close can you get? I'll give you some insight of my thoughts on that for that, some of that vague language. But you want to be careful around structures, right? So because that poison gas can affect individuals and animals that are inside those structures. And then, of course, you also have the issue of non-target kills. And say, well, don't you have non-target kills with bait? Well, of course you do. The difference is, if I use a bait inside of a burrow to kill, let's say, a ground squirrel, and let's say there happens to be a snake in the burrow, well, the snake is probably not going to be harmed by the bait, because the snake really isn't interested in the bait. But if I fumigate that burrow, every animal that's sharing space with the target animal in that burrow is likely going to die. So this is where you're getting some non-target kills, because whatever's in that burrow is going to take it for the team, because the fumigant's going to poison more than just simply the target animals. So that is one of the downsides of using fumigants. So we have fumigants basically in 3 regulatory flavors. Now, I'm not going to talk about all of these here today. I'm going to focus on the ignitable gas cartridge. But nevertheless, just so that you're aware, you have the carbon monoxide injectors. Those are non-regulated, right over in the far left on your screen. But also we have the ignitable gas cartridge. That's a general use product right now. Then you also have rat ice, which is dry ice. It's produced by Bell Labs. That's used to fumigate rats. Disperses carbon dioxide as opposed to monoxide. You also have the Leafitech canisters that disperse CO2. That's being used, of course, on rodents, and it has a pretty broad label. I'm hoping to do a talk on that particular product sometime down the road. And then, of course, you have the restricted use product right now, and I'm recording this in 2024. Just want to make a quick note. I'm going to talk about it later, but understand that the EPA is making a lot of changes to rodenticide regulations, and one of those changes is going to be a requirement for increased emphasis on what's called non-soil fumigation licensing. So many states are going to then establish a separate category for non-soil fumigation. Boy, that's a very complicated term. Yeah, it's basically if you want to use fumigants to control rodents in the field, which is non-soil. You're not treating the soil. There's fumigation for that, but you're trying to treat the animals that are in the soil, which is like burrowing rodents typically, you may need to have another license depending on how your state is looking to fulfill that particular regulatory requirement by the EPA. So change is coming, and so I'm not sure whether ignitable gas cartridges are going to continue to be general use down the road. I don't know the answer to that, so I'm going to be interested to see how that plays out. But whatever the law is here, and of course we always want to make sure we're following the label, change is certainly coming, and some of the principles that I'm talking about here today are going to apply whether the law changes or not. Well, the last product, of course, is phosphine gas. You may know of it as aluminum phosphide. Highly restricted product. We're not talking about that today. You cannot even purchase that or you apply it without having a pesticide license. And there is some good reason for that. That's some pretty toxic stuff. Not that we should be cavalier with any of these products. Of course, you never want to be that way, but that takes it to a different level, right? It's a difference between a bullet and a grenade. And so aluminum phosphide is extraordinarily toxic. It's a wonderful product, has an important role, but it is restricted, and so there's a lot of restrictions on that. So ignitable gas cartridges. Let's get back to our ignitable gas cartridges, just so you have a picture again, like the giant destroyer is an ignitable gas cartridge. So it is a general use product right now, and I'm recording this in January of 2024. Right now it's a general use product. So what that means is you don't have to have a license to purchase it or use it on your own property. However, if you are going to be using it on a commercial basis or using it on someone else's property, you're likely going to need to have a license. You need to be sure you're contacting your state Department of Agriculture or a pesticide agency and make sure you're properly licensed before you're using it. But as it stands now, if you're looking to use this on your own ground, it's a general use product. You should be able to purchase it over the counter. Now, as another side note, just because you're licensed to use the product doesn't mean you're legally able to control the animals that you're going to use it on. So that's where you need to contact your wildlife agency within your state to ensure that you're following that law as well. I have other podcasts where I've discussed that difference between Department of Agriculture and the Division of Fisheries and Wildlife in your particular state, because wildlife control or vertebrate pest control, we cover two different agencies. One regulates the pesticide, one regulates the management of the animal. So just because you have the right to use the product doesn't mean you have the right to control the animal, because wildlife agencies have control over the animal. Departments of Agriculture have control over the pesticide. Yes, if it feels a little complicated, it is, but thankfully you can navigate this as long as you understand that the method is one thing and the ability to control the animal is another thing, and those are two different agencies. And so the reason why it's often not a problem is a lot of times the animal that you're going to use the fumigant on is often non-regulated. So it's still managed by the state wildlife agency, but no license is required to do anything with that animal. But that can be different from state to state, province to province, wherever country you're listening to this. Just make sure you're following whatever those regulations are in your particular community. So how does carbon monoxide kill? So ignitable gas cartridges, as the name sounds, they burn and they're releasing a toxic gas. The toxic gas that they're releasing is carbon monoxide. That's 1O. So it's the chemical symbol is CO, right? One carbon, one oxygen, as opposed to CO2, which is carbon dioxide, which is one carbon molecule to two oxygen molecules. Carbon monoxide kills by basically bonding with the hemoglobin. Now, the hemoglobin is the part of our blood that carries oxygen through our tissues. So it releases carbon dioxide to our lungs and then takes oxygen to itself and then moves that oxygen to the cells that we need it. And then it picks up CO2, brings that CO2 back to the lungs. We exhale CO2 from our lungs, and then we inhale the oxygen to disperse, which is then dispersed through our bloodstream through these cells known as hemoglobin. Carbon monoxide messes that all up. And how does it do that? Because carbon monoxide attaches to the hemoglobin, so the hemoglobin isn't available to take oxygen. So think of it like a dump truck. If the dump truck is full, it can't carry any soil. Well, same way, if the hemoglobin has carbon monoxide, if it's carrying carbon monoxide, it can't carry oxygen. So therefore, it's trapped. So it's flowing around your body, but it can't they can't take the CO2 and bring it back to your lungs and release it. It says, well, why doesn't the hemoglobin just get rid of the CO when it gets to the lungs? Unfortunately, carbon monoxide bonds with that hemoglobin, and it takes time to release it. So if the hemoglobin has a choice between grabbing oxygen and grabbing carbon monoxide, it wants to grab the carbon monoxide. There's something about the chemical affinity. It wants to grab that carbon monoxide. This is why it's so deadly. So it kills the animal by suffocating it, what we call at the cellular level. So the blood's moving, but it's not picking up any carbon dioxide, and it's not able to release any oxygen to the cells. One of the side effects of carbon monoxide poisoning is headaches. So if you're applying these particular products that are using carbon monoxide and you're getting a headache, don't ignore it. That's an early sign of carbon monoxide poisoning. So let me explain that a little bit more. So if we're using devices, that's the carbon monoxide injectors. We're not talking about those today, but the principle of carbon monoxide, understand that once we start getting exposed to 6,400 parts per million, we can get headaches and dizziness in 2 minutes. But even at lower levels, if we're exposed at 200 parts per million, for 2 to 3 hours, we'll get a headache. And then, of course, people that have long-term exposure or significant exposure, there can be neurological damage to our system. So I'm not trying to frighten you here. I'm not trying to tell you not to use these products. The way I talk about pesticides is often like firearms, right? So firearms do bad things when they're pointed in the wrong direction. If you're pointing the gun in the right direction, everything's fine. Same way with carbon monoxide or the ignitable gas cartridges. If you're using the product according to the label and according to the laws of your state or locality, you should be fine if you're keeping your wits about you, right? You don't want to be over there huffing the gas. Now, thankfully, with ignitable gas cartridges, the smoke is so acrid, no one wants to breathe it. You will cough up a lung when you're breathing it. But when we think about some of these other devices, like if you're using a carbon monoxide injector, for instance, you could be breathing that because it's not as noxious, right, as opposed to these ignitable gas cartridges. Bottom line is you don't want to be exposing yourself to carbon monoxide any more than necessary. It's hard to do it. If you're using an ignitable gas cartridge, it's very hard to expose yourself to the carbon monoxide because you're going to put this down the burrow. You're going to light it, put it down the burrow, close the burrow, so the gas should be staying in the burrow, not coming back to you. But if you're doing large acreages, some of that gas is going to leak off, and so things can happen in that regard. So be safe. You want to avoid the smoke, of course, and you want to make sure you're monitoring your health and your well-being. Don't ignore a headache. Are you feeling dizzy? Are you getting nauseous? Are you getting blurred vision? Don't ignore that. Don't just power through. You want to make sure you're careful with this. Don't think for 1 minute that your air purifying respirator is going to help you here. It won't work. You will still be poisoned. You'd have to have an air replacement respirator or something that has its own cylinder. Like with firefighters going into a burning building, they carry their own air with them. That's the only way you're going to be able to be around carbon monoxide. Be careful around structures when you're using the ignitable gas cartridges. The labels will tell you can't use them near structures. What's near? My advice to you would be I would not go any closer to a building at least than 10 feet. Depending on the animal. Some animals like pocket gophers or prairie dogs, you may want to be out more toward 30 or 40 feet, maybe even out to 100 feet, right? So you don't want to be near structures because the carbon monoxide can leak into basements and foundations and come up into the living space of structures. So read the label carefully. If it gives you a distance, follow that distance. But always be cognizant of the burrowing rodent. That burrow may go up to the structure. So think about which animals. So different animals have different size burrows. So keep that in mind. So in terms of general use, the active ingredients of these products typically are sodium nitrate, sulfur, charcoal. Again, you need something that's going to burn vigorously, and then throwing off that carbon monoxide. Always consider fire risk. One of the reasons why you don't want to use an ignitable gas cartridge near a structure is it can set the building on fire. Read one article out of Canada. A guy had a woodchuck up against the building, put the ignitable gas cartridge down the hole, lit it, it set the building on fire, and the woodchuck still got away. So be careful, right? So don't use these products near structures. Be careful about how dry it is. So be in a situation where you don't want to set the prairie on fire or set the neighborhood on fire, right? So in drought conditions, I recommend to people they're best used, ignitable gas cartridges are best used after a rain. And the reason is twofold. Number one, it reduces the fire risk. Number two, the soil being moist holds the toxic gas better, so it's not leaking from the burrow to the surrounding soil. And that definitely makes it more effective because we want that gas to be available for the animal living in that particular burrow. A label may require you to get an endangered species bulletin. This is a screenshot of Bulletins Live where you would want to, there it is, obtaining an EPA bulletin. Let me put my cursor up there. There we go. Right? This is the Bulletins Live 2 page. So if you look at the EPA's Endangered Species Protection Bulletin page, you would click that. That brings you to Bulletins Live 2. It's the numeral 2, or written out 2, I should say. It's not the numeral 2 on the URL. But EPA's Bulletins Live, LIVE, two, TWO. And you would type in the location of where you wanted to apply the product. It'll Google Earth down to that particular spot. It will tell you if there are any restrictions on pesticides in that particular area, and that's based on whether they're endangered or threatened species in that particular area, and also some other political rules. What I mean by political is not political party, but are there regulations in that particular area that restrict the use of pesticides for certain reasons. A lot of your Native American lands, for example, will have certain restrictions because of they're governed under different laws than the state that they're residing in. You would then print that bulletin out, and you would attach that bulletin to your label, and that becomes your requirements. That shows there are no restrictions. There's no pink on this particular screen. Therefore, it's telling you that there are no restrictions on the use of pesticides in that given area. These are time limited, so you have to make sure you're careful with that. Notice that there is a date. This one I did in February of 2022. But just to go back, notice that there's an application month. Now, you can change that date. You can make it go forward, of course, but you'd want to make sure that you are legal in that regard, and your label will tell you whether you have to obtain one of these endangered species bulletins. Expect the requirements of a lot more of your labels to require bulletins live too, because of the recent changes within the EPA. We're still waiting to see how that's all going to pan out, but I would anticipate that more labels are going to require you to consult bulletins live too, so change is coming. Make sure you keep your record keeping. That's going to be a requirement, of course, from your division of Department of Agriculture and your pesticide regulations. And so this is going to be important. You don't want someone saying, oh, I'm getting a headache now because you used a fumigant. Make sure you're following all those rules and keeping those records and following that. So wind direction, of course, would be very important, and speed, because that's going to matter, because if the person complaining was upwind, there's no way they would have been exposed to the fumigant, right? So obviously these are things that you can use to protect yourself. So in terms of the ignitable gas cartridge, we basically have 3 different kinds. I'm only listing a couple of them here. In terms of the Giant Destroyers, one brand. There could be some other brands out there, but that's the one I see inside the hardware stores. But then there's also the other product from Pocatello Supply Depot out of Idaho, and that's the organization that supplies materials to USDA Wildlife Services. Now, last year, they had trouble manufacturing their ignitable gas cartridge. The ignitable gas cartridge that they produce is on the right-hand side. Notice it comes in 2 flavors. The small version is for rodents, ground squirrels, prairie dogs. The larger version, the one in the bottom picture, is for predators. That's for skunks and coyotes. Make sure if you're ordering it from Pocatello Supply Depot, there's no website, so you're going to have to call them or send in an order form and get that material shipped to you. But again, these are still general use products, so you don't have to have a license to purchase it. But they can be a bit pricey, about $2.50, $3 when you probably figure in shipping a piece. And so you're typically buying them. I think the smallest amount you can purchase is 25 from Pocatello Supply Depot, but don't quote me on that. Of course, the Giant Destroyer, they typically come in containers, packages of 4, and you're going to be probably paying $14, $15 for that. So again, pretty pricey on a per treatment level. However, for a lot of wildlife control operators, they're not dealing with scores of acreages. They're often dealing with small lots where maybe there's just 1, maybe 2 burrows, and the cost is minimal given the advantages that fumigants can offer you. Make sure before you light the cartridge that it fits in the burrow. That's going to be particularly important when we're dealing with the wider ones. That can be almost 2 inches in width for that one. These are quite thin. They're about a little bit wider than your finger, or 2 fingers, I probably should say. So they'll fit in, but make sure it fits in the burrow deep enough so that you can backfill it without smothering the cartridge. And you do that before you light it. It's really embarrassing if you're trying to negotiate it, because once it starts burning, they burn quite vigorously. You'll hear them called as smoke bombs, but they don't explode. They're not a bomb. They're just burn vigorously, and the smoke coming out is quite dark and very acrid, of course. But you don't want to be breathing that, so you want to make sure that you can get it down into the burrow before the wick hits the main cartridge, and that but it's deep enough so that you can cover the hole and plug that hole without smothering the cartridge with loose soil. One of the reasons why people don't have success with ignitable gas cartridges is that they've smothered the cartridge so it doesn't have a complete burn. We want to be sure that it's free to burn so that toxic gas fills the burrow and, of course, suffocates out the animal that we want to kill. So again, as I said before, EPA regulations are changing. I'm recording this in January of 2024. So we'll see what happens with some of these changes. Hopefully we'll get them maybe by July or so, and we do, I'll probably comment on them again. But there's likely for many states, they're going to require you to have a separate category called non-soil fumigation to do fumigation of burrows. As part of your work as a pesticide applicator, for example, or a vertebrate pest controller. You're going to have a separate license. Previously, you would have just sort of maybe an ornamental and turf, and you'd be able to do some fumigation of burrows, or perhaps you had a structural license depending on how your state categorized things and how far you could go away from a structure. Those of you with the vertebrate pest category would be able to use fumigants, but with these new changes from the EPA, there's either going to be a requirement of more training within those individual categories to keep you being able to use fumigants, or the state is going to simply have a separate category completely for you to use fumigants in non-soil applications, which of course is burrowing type rodents. So find out what's going to happen, because it's going to be, if you get another license, it means there's going to be probably another fee involved, and of course additional continuing ed training for you to maintain your losses. So the price of using these fumigants over time is likely going to increase, but it's kind of who knows how it's all going to be ultimately playing out and what that impact is going to be for your particular business. Ignitable gas cartridges really have an important role. They can be a bit pricey, but in certain limited circumstances, for a lot of your small lots, or if you just need to control something, they can be quite convenient. But the labels on these products are also becoming more restrictive. Some of them are going to require you to view the site and inspect it at least a day before you apply the application. So that's going to be a couple of visits, so you can see that they're concerned about these non-target kills within the fumigation, within your using fumigation. So that obviously raises the cost and reduces the convenience of the particular product. Always follow the label, read the label before you purchase the product to make sure it's going to be suitable for your situation, and make sure you're following all of your state Department of Agriculture or pesticide rules. You're following the label, and you're also making sure you're being safe and following the regulations governing vertebrate pests within your state from your Division of Fisheries and Wildlife. Whew. Got that all out. You've been listening to Stephen Vantassel as part of the Pest Geek Podcast family. This is Living the Wildlife as part of the Pest Geek Podcast family. I'll get it out eventually. Glad you've been able to hang with me here. I hope you found some interesting information about the use of ignitable gas cartridges, that we want to be sure we're using them safely and effectively and legally. And Again, if you have questions, comments, do reach out to me. I'd love to hear from you again at wildlifecontrolconsultant@gmail.com. Wildlifecontrolconsultant@gmail.com. I'd love to hear if you have suggestions for shows. Perhaps you'd like to be on the show or you have an issue that you'd like to discuss. Would love to discuss that with you and schedule a time to do the interview. And of course, this is Living the Wildlife. Why do we call it Living the Wildlife? Well, because we want you to live the wildlife, not be the wildlife. Be careful, everyone. Take care.